Tyrus, Kanye walked out halfway through our interview, and it was quite a struggle to get him to come and sit back. And I'm glad I did, because then we ended up getting to where I think he, in his mind, he wanted to get to, which is I think he wanted to atone for what he'd done and the damage he caused, but he was sort of too fired up and too proud to actually go there until we got towards the end. But there was another thing I had a sort of confrontation with him about, and that's his very inflammatory comments about George Floyd, which now led to George Floyd's family suing him for $250 million over how George Floyd died. Ken has been watching, Ye, to give him his proper name, has been watching videos, films, which has led him to believe that actually he was on fentanyl, that's what killed him. The coroner says, yes, there was fentanyl in his blood, but actually it's quite clear, the coroner, that actually what killed George Floyd was the actions of the police officers suppressing his neck. When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, I think it just goes back to he's a tremendous artist. He's a genius in the music studio. But outside, he falls for things like this. Listen, this was not a debated issue in this country. And it didn't, and you know, Mr. Simmons made a great point when he talked about Martin Luther King, and it took a village, and it took a Jewish rabbi, and it took Hispanics, and it took different people. And we're sitting here today at a table. We have an Englishman, a Jewish rock star, and a black Republican who wears a gold chain talking about a black billionaire. So that pretty much shows things are going very well. I would just like to point that out for the record. But having said that, there is nobody that is questioning the George Floyd thing except for people who are trying to exploit it. And this is where Kanye's fame is his worst enemy, because he says those things, and when he says those things, it resonates, and therefore his defamation is more dangerous than other people's. And he says something like that, and you always have to look around about who he's around at the time when he makes these comments, and it always seems to fit their narrative, and they benefit from it, but they're not the ones getting sued. It's him. And again, everything that came out, his anti-Semitic comments, the things that he said about George Floyd were stupid, unexcusable, and he should apologize for them. He has no base. There's no even reason to say those things other than being put in these boxes and lashing out. And again, I cannot applaud you more, because you've done more for him in that interview that he won't recognize it now. But later on in his life, when he looks back, he'll be like, because most people would have got that first hot take of 10 minutes and him walking out, because that's top page news everywhere. So I applaud you for staying the course, because I can't think of anyone else that would. Yeah, it was, I mean, Gene Simmons, you know, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? We live in a world dominated by social media. It's easy to fall down conspiracy theory, you know, rabbit warrens, isn't it? Because there's so much stuff out there. A lot of it is not well sourced. It's just people spewing nonsense, but people buy into it, and then very quickly they believe it. And that is a problem, I think, in modern society.
I believe strongly, look, I read a lot, and so do we all, and we're fairly well educated about the woke society and cancel culture and, you know, all the other stuff that tortures everybody, not just the people on this panel. But I just want to go back to the people that seem to be away from the mainstream culture, call it what you will, are hurt. You've got the polarizing political issue, which are people all the way on the far left or the far right. They don't feel connected to what's going on in the world. So they resort to all kinds of conspiracies and hoaxes and whatever just to push their agenda. But let's not forget the pain, okay? So it seems to me, as somebody in the peanut gallery, Kanye is a guy who seems very hurt, who feels... and perhaps rightfully so, being African-American in America. Look, I saw it firsthand. I heard horror stories. I lived with a few years with an iconic African-American female singer. I don't want to mention your name because I call her, I respect her and love her too much. I lived with her children, and I heard horror stories when she was in the #1 vocal group, an all-girl group in America, and went and headlined above the Dave Clark 5 and went down south to do concerts. And on the way out, they found bullet holes in the bus. This didn't happen in the 1800s. This is in the 1960s. And she and the girl groups were not allowed to stay in a regular hotel. They had to stay in what was called a colored hotel. That was not too far off in the past. Recognize it. Don't whitewash it as they say it. It's a fact.
Yeah.
Racism exists. I get it. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Look, you've got lots of Jews out there and Muslims and Buddhists and all kinds of well-meaning people who actually like you and support African Americans or people who are brown or come from all areas who support you. By making these comments, you're alienating people who actually support you.
I think that's
and
spot on, Gene. I do think a pain is lying behind a lot of these outbursts from Kanye. I think he's got a lot of pain there that he needs to work through, and I was cognizant of that, and that's why I'm glad he, having walked out, he then came back, and we really got to a much better place actually by the end, where he seemed much calmer and more self-aware about the impact of his words, and that's the key thing. Got to leave it there. Gene Simmons, thank you so much. Honestly, brilliant perspective. Tyrus, thank you.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed that conversation.